So, Madison Sourdough. I started working at Madison Sourdough 8 years ago. Actually, 2 days ago it was my 8-year anniversary. Madison Sourdough was founded by a man named Cam Ramsey in the early 90s, like she'd said. It changed locations, I believe, 3 different times in its lifespan. It closed the doors once or twice, reopened again on Willie Street when they changed ownership, which is the current ownership, which is Drew and David, who I work for. Originally, Madison Sourdough was known for, and we still are, for a crispy European-style bread done in a very simplistic way, using nothing more than flour, water, and salt. Technique and time is the main ingredient in what we do. Since purchasing the company, we have purchased a mill, which has really kind of changed the game. Wisconsin is pretty lucky to have access to amazing farmers and agricultural people that make interesting different products, and some of them are heirloom grain. We can mill some really interesting rare heirloom varieties and come up with some really interesting recipes. So since purchasing the company, we honored the original recipes of the company, but we've added about 60 other bread recipes to the menu that rotate seasonally based on what is available. So originally the philosophy was finding ingredients to match the formulas. Now we're writing formulas for the ingredients. Today, what I'm going to be demonstrating is not going to be anything related to bread, even though that's really more our identity. We also have our patisserie, which is another part of our company that features more on French technique of different desserts and things. Now, these are 2 holiday things that I think are very approachable. Some of that stuff is really over the top. I'm more of a savory bread baker myself, but with that being said, I have about 16 years of baking experience at this point, and it's been all over the board with different products. So this, I feel, is a pretty approachable products that I'm going to be making with you guys tonight. I started originally baking at Whole Foods Market right out of high school. It kind of found me. I didn't mean to be a baker. It just kind of happened. I kind of fell in love with the profession. Took a little break from it, which I think is normal of a lot of younger people. Third shift doesn't usually work well with people in their early 20s. But eventually I found my way back to it, ended up working for 2 independently owned bakeries, and the last one in Madison was La Brioche, and I reopened that location when they moved locations. And really, I went to San Francisco and visited a friend for 2 months and took a leave and visited Tartine Bakery and visited a couple other bakeries that I really admired, and it really inspired me to make that brand of artisan bread. And there's really only one bakery in town that has a true identity of what they're doing, and that's Madison Sourdough. So when I came back, I was hell-bent on getting a job there, and I just kind of showed up and started staging, which is a kitchen term where you go and you work for food, essentially. If you're traveling as a chef or a baker, you can go to a bakery a lot of the time and say, hi, I'm a person from out of state, and I'd like to work with you guys for a day for some product, and they usually will let you jump in, and it's a really cool way to experience a different, kitchen culture and a different technique. But more importantly, it's a really easy way to get an interview without scheduling an interview. So that's kind of what I did, and it went really well. And I said, can I come back tomorrow? And they're like, well, we're not really hiring, but sure. And I came back the next day, staged again. I said, can I come back tomorrow? They said, sure. And by the end of the 4th day, they said, all right, you're hired. That's fine. You're all right. This will work. So the rest is history. I've been there ever since, and we've really expanded quite a bit in that time. I worked my way up to an assistant lead baker, which I did for about 5 years, and now I've evolved out of the bakery into an administrative role, but I also do a lot of cooking classes, demonstrations, talks, meeting with our farmers that we're sourcing grain from, and meeting with a lot of local chefs in the community and helping them with menu development, kind of different pairings that we think would be a good fit when they're doing their menu change. And we do a menu change as well, so it's kind of nice to have those conversations before it happens. So the products I'm going to make tonight are going to be the bourbon pecan bars, which is a holiday special that we only make around from Thanksgiving till about New Year's at Madison Sourdough. The caramel recipe I'm using is from our pastry chef, Pierre Ferland, who is a French pastry chef from Quebec, and he's been with us for about 6 years, and he is brilliant. It's probably better that I taught this class instead of him. His stuff can get pretty technically advanced, but we're really happy to have him, and this caramel recipe is absolutely gold. Now, the portions that I gave you is pretty heavy because it really doesn't turn out as well when you do it in quarter size, which is what I would recommend if you're doing this at home, but half batch works pretty well. So whatever this is, you can divide it in half and do the same thing. You're also going to notice that the 3 recipes I gave you are all in metric. European bakery, now we have some books up here, and you'll notice if you look through all these books, the recipes in there are also going to be in metric. Artisan baking and European baking is never going to be in cups, teaspoons. This is an American baking phenomenon that the rest of the world doesn't use, and I think for very good reason. Cups and teaspoons and these sort of things are very inaccurate, if you ask me. If I had 3 kinds of flour, and that flour is going to change based on variables, and in the world of baking, our job is to manage variables to get consistent turnout. That's really our goal. So you're never going to put a dash of this or a pinch of this. It's always going to be precise, and precision baking is really the key to getting a good product. So if I weighed a cup of flour and put it on a scale, and then weighed another cup of flour and put it on a scale, I bet they're not going to weigh the exact same amount. One's going to be a little heavy, one's going to be a little light. Everything in my world is done by percentage, and baking percentage is the world that we live in and kind of operate in to make sure that we have consistency across the board. Or if there's consistently something not turning out, we can pinpoint where that issue is and adjust just 1 or 2 ingredients to make it work again to manage whatever variable is giving us issues. So I would strongly recommend everybody in this room to go out and purchase a digital scale that measures in grams. They're very inexpensive. You can get them on Amazon for under 20 bucks, and that's all the scale you need. You can buy them locally for about 50 bucks. And if you're a smart shopper, you can definitely do a lot cheaper than that. They're all pretty solid options, just as long as they go into gram. That's really what you're looking for, kilogram down to gram. And by doing that, you're going to get a much more precise measurement and weigh out. It's a small cost to pay to be able to speak the language of artisan baking. So that's really, if I go, yes, go ahead.
What if the recipe that you're doing is in cups?
So you can do 1 of 2 things. You can either, you can go with that recipe as is, or what I do is I always convert it. When I find that if there's a baking recipe that's in cups and teaspoons and all that, I typically don't take that recipe seriously. I will weigh it out and see what the percentages are at that point. The way I figure out a percentage is your flour percentage is 100%. So you take whatever number the flour is, and then everything else is a percentage of that. So that's going to tell you how much salt there is, how much sugar. Typically with good formulas, there's a lot of similarities. You're going to use 2% salt. You're going to use so much leaven that's going to match the amount of sugar. And there's just things that are going to match. Sometimes if there's something that doesn't really make a lot of sense, it's going to give you a reason why that is. So you can convert that recipe, and it's still the same recipe. Especially if you like it, then you'll know what it is. But the good news about that is it's a lot easier to manipulate portion size when it is in this format. So if I wanted to do it 5 times that size, you do that number times 5, that's your number for each ingredient, and it's extremely accurate. It's a lot less complicated in the end, but it's a little different if you're accustomed to using cups, if that makes sense. Excuse me. So so I'm going to make a caramel for you guys first. That one is, I'm going to let that get started because that's going to take about 20 minutes. Then I'm also going to mix a molasses cookie, which we also have samples of that we'll give you guys a portion of at the end. We also have some hot apple cider and our pecan bars. I didn't do all the parts of the pecan bar because I don't know if I'd have enough time, for one. And 2, there's a lot of similarities in technique with the cookie process and the filling process. So I feel like it's almost the same process, just different ingredients, so I can, to double up on that would be a little overkill. I'm also going to demonstrate how to pin out some dough in dock and do a blind bake. Now obviously I don't have an oven, so I'm not going to actually bake it, but I can describe it. And blind baking is, I feel like, the difference between having a flaky pie crust on the bottom or having a doughy, kind of wet pie crust, like one you buy in the store. that doesn't really seem as exciting. So for me, I always like to blind bake my doughs, especially if they're getting filled. I'm going to kind of rush through. I'll answer your question in just a second. But I kind of want to get started here and get my things going, and then I'll answer a couple of questions, if that's okay. Well, you can go ahead and go first.
Well, I was just wondering in the dough, what's the white flour and the whole wheat flour? Do you have to do?
You don't have to. I like to add a little bit of wheat flour for added flavor and nutrition. White flour would work just fine across the board. A small amount of wheat flour is going to give you kind of a speckled look, and for a pie, for this one, it really doesn't matter as much. But for a pie dough, I just like the way it looks, and I also really like the way it tastes. So I like to put a little bit of wheat flour. I don't make too many recipes that are strictly white flour, unless it's a dessert recipe for the most part. But yeah, that's just the recipe that we have at Madison Sourdough for all of our pie doughs, and it just gives them a little more flavor and nutrition. Okay, so we're going to get started on the caramel. Caramel is a really simple product, but it's really easy to screw it up. It goes against your instincts. As instinctually, if you see something cooking, what do you want to do? You see it start to boil. You want to stir, right? You're going to want to stir it to make sure it doesn't burn. With caramel, that is not what we want you to do. So first thing is I have my 1 kilo of sugar right here, and I'm going to go ahead and dump that right into my pot. Now, from there, this is the beauty of a scale. I can just put this on and zero it. Then I'm going to add my corn syrup. You could also use glucose. Probably corn syrup is more accessible for most people than glucose. That's more of an industrial ingredient, but it would also work. And you're going to add right into the sugar. Where did my recipe go? Oh, that's my caramel recipe. Ah, there it is. 150 grams of sugar. And I'm going to do a little well and make sure I pour right in the middle so I don't stick any to the sides, if at all possible. Okay, so I have my 150 grams. Next, I also weighed out the water, but I'm not really going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and go. I want it to be, I'm just going to kind of pour it in and mix it by hand. My goal is to get this pretty much incorporated, but almost in like a sludge kind of texture here, so that all the sugar is hydrated, but I'm cooking all this water out. So putting too much water in is counterproductive. It's just going to add more time to your caramel. So really, adding it in a little bit at a time and letting it hydrate like this and mixing it by hand is what Pierre recommends and what I'd recommend as well. Also, when you're doing this, try to avoid using an aluminum pot if possible. Try to use a galvanized steel. Aluminum, though you might not pick it up, it does give, when you're dealing with the cream and the sugar in this and it cooks for so long, it does give a bit of a metallic finish once it cools, like a flavor, a finish to the flavor. Most people wouldn't notice it, but it drives me crazy. So I'd recommend not using aluminum if you can. Not the end of the world if you have to, but it's a little better if you do. So then I kind of have this all kind of hydrated like that. Roughly, there's no dry spots and no wet spots. All right, I'm going to turn this all the way up. Let that start going. I'm going to set a 20-minute timer. And my goal right now is not to touch it. So that's the main goal. So we want to let this thing cook, and I'm letting the sugar heat all the way up. It's going to be at about 500 degrees, so this is not one you're going to want to put your finger in and taste. It's very important. Oh, can I get you to fill this with water so I can use it to cool it at the end? Thank you.
And I have to make a brief, quick public service announcement. If there's a Honda Accord, maroon color, 617 p.m., your lights are on.
Okay.
What temperature were you heating it?
I have it all the way up, and I would recommend doing the same, just high heat.
Using your burner, you would do it. You don't think it's going to burn?
No, it's not. It's fine. What it's going to do is it's going to cook the water off. and it's okay. So you want it, the color that you're getting, the caramelization, isn't burning, but sugar has such a high melting temp, it's going to be all right. So you just want to keep it on a high heat. That's recommended. Within reason, make sure your pot's big enough that you're going to be able to work with it like that, but for the most part.
Container of water was not 100 grams?
No, absolutely not. It's far more.
Just guessed it.
I just kind of did it to size. That's right. If you use exactly 100 grams, it would probably be good enough, but I just want to make sure that it's all hydrated. So that's more important, that all the sugar has been hydrated before you start, because you're going to cook all this water off. All this water is going to evaporate out. That's what I'm cooking off, and all that will remain is the caramelized sugar. So while this is cooking, I'm going to go ahead and start my cookie mix. Cookie mixes, I feel, are kind of all the same. You're whipping air into the butter, creaming the butter, if you will, and that's going to be part of your leaven. In this recipe, we're going to be putting baking powder. Now, the simple way that I always tell people that are new at sourdough, baking soda spreads, baking powder lifts. So, I'm sorry, did I say baking powder? We're going to have baking soda in this. So cookies are typically going to have a baking soda because it's going to spread it out. If I'm using like a biscuit, a cake, anything else like that, you're going to use baking powder, that's going to lift. So that's what we're using today, is a baking soda, and that's pretty common in most cookie mixes. I'm going to scale everything out, but I have a couple of tricks that I want to teach you because I think it's pretty cool. Again, my goal when I'm making any kind of recipe, thank you, you just put that right there. My goal is to get complete consistency, and to do that, I need all the ingredients from the recipe in the bowl. So like a molasses, for instance, is a tricky one because it's going to stick to whatever you're weighing it into or whatever you're measuring it from. It's really going to be hard to get a complete, accurate thing. This is where scaling is the best. So I scaled out my sugar for the recipe. I'm going to dig a little cove in the middle here. Then I'm going to zero my scale, grab my molasses. So the molasses will stick to the sugar, but as long as I don't get it to the metal on the side, I can dump it right into the bowl and it'll all jump in at once. It's kind of a cool little trick. So for this recipe, we're doing 99 grams of molasses. So I'm pouring this right into the sugar, like that. There we go. So now it's all kind of sitting in the middle of the sugar. So when it's ready time to dump in, it all goes right in and none of it sticks to the bowl. So that's a really neat trick. Also, when I added my glucose or my corn syrup to my sugar, I did the same thing. I poured it right into the center of my sugar. Instead of weighing it into a separate container and then scooping it in, I'm not going to get the exact amount. My goal is precision. So everything is by percentage. So the closer you can get to the exact number, the more likely it's going to turn out perfect. Next, I'm going to weigh out my butter.
Do you ever put more than one thing in like in that bowl? Let's say you wanted to measure a couple of things.
Yeah.
Did you do re-zero each time?
Yeah, exactly. So you can do it a couple different ways. You could either scale the amount of flour, then zero, and then add the next amount, and then zero, and keep doing that. You can scale one each separately, but I always recommend if you're going to do it into there, make sure that you're doing it in small piles so that if you go a little bit over, you can grab it right out of that pile and get it back to where it's supposed to be. If you're like just kind of willy-nilly dumping it everywhere, if you go a little too far, it's really tough to get that out without adjusting the percentages of everything. So yeah, it's a good question though. Let's see, I'll take this, that'll work. Now this is a really neat cookie. Now at the end of this, you'd roll this in white sugar once they're done. That's what gives it the kind of sugar glazed top before you'd bake it. And as it settles and spreads, it kind of gives that cool look on the top. This is one of the only recipes that we would ever do that with. 227. Now my butter's a little bit cold, so I'm going to whip that for a second to warm it up before we get going. Now once I turn this mixer on, it's going to get kind of loud, so again, if you can't hear me, by all means, let me know. If you look in here, my sugar is boiling at this point, which is great. I'm just gonna, I didn't bring a brush. That was a bummer. That's all right. That'll work. I just want to make sure I get all the sugar from the side down in so it doesn't burn on the sides before the rest of the sugar is done. Usually I would use a brush for this. All right. All right, so now, let's get my butter right inside the bowl. I'm going to use a paddle for this. Sorry, I'm going to have to come around. And when creaming butter, you want to do it on a pretty high speed or fast speed. Because it's a cold butter, you can bring the butter back up to temp. Well, it's not cold, it's just room temperature, which happens to be kind of chilly today. Usually you want it at room temp, but that also can work against you in the summer where it can be too soft. So microwaving is really the best way to manage your cold butter if it's already coming straight out of the fridge to get it softened. But each microwave is a little different, so I don't have an exact science to that because each one's a little you got to kind of tinker with. But if your butter is just a little bit cold like this, you can just heat it up with friction heat from the mixer itself. So I'm going to let this guy kind of get going here and mix that up in the bowl. I'm probably going to scrape that down 2-3 times before the end of my before we're all said and done here. In the meantime, I'm going to scale out the rest of my ingredients while this butter is breaking down a little bit. All right, so 2 eggs. Each egg equals roughly 50 grams. So this is pretty darn near close, about 90, which is close enough for me today. I have that, all right. Next, I'm gonna weigh out all my dries. So first, I'm gonna start with the third bowl. Oh, I have it over there. Can I have you dump that water out for me? Sorry, thank you. Now it's really important that you make sure you get a good, everything is gonna move to the sides whenever you're using a KitchenAid or any other kind of mixer, so you always wanna make sure you get a good scrape on everything, bring everything back to the middle. I always recommend using unsalted and then you add your salt in the recipe. If you're cooking, salted butter is always a nice thing. I don't know who asked the question, I lost you. Oh yeah, sorry. Sure, I know who I'm talking to. Yeah, I always recommend unsalted for baking. Particularly if you're adding salt, there's no need to use a salted butter. If you're cooking, it's a little different. So salted butter is great. You know, you want that ingredient to have flavor already. Now there's a lot of differences here between cooks and bakers, and I'll go into that in a little bit because I'm a little bit of both. But definitely culturally and technically wise, there's a very different way that we approach food. And so bakers, like I said, it's all about precision and knowing your ingredients. So unsalted would be recommended so you can add the right percentage. All right. Yes, there it is.
I have to say that Tyson is one of our most knowledgeable and well-spoken presenters. And you're getting a lot of great information. And if you can't write quite quick enough and you'd like to relive these magic moments, a big shout out to Monona. This entire demonstration is being filmed for your YouTube channel, also their Facebook, and your Instagram. Also very important
Oh, I just got nervous. You guys are fine with the internet. Who knows? Who knows what they'll think? All right, so I added my 540 grams of white flour. This is an all-purpose Sourdough I had by King Arthur. Strongly recommend working with King Arthur flours. They really don't make a bad flour. I'd always stay away from any bleached or bromated flours. Those are just unnecessarily a cheap ingredient that's really not good for your digestion. So I'd recommend trying to stay away from bleached flours or bromated flours. Those are just and those are usually going to be the Surefine ultra cheap flours. There's a reason that it's cheap, and that is that they skipped a lot of steps in aging that flour. So to use it, they usually use a chemical process, air bleaching, to turn the flour white, which is fine by the FDA, but not fine with me. So I wouldn't recommend using that if you can. It's not that much more. Flour is pretty cheap. So anything by that company, I'd recommend. All right, so at this point, my butter is looking like it's getting warmer. So I'm gonna go ahead, pop this down, give it one last stir, and I'm gonna dump in all my sugar. What are we doing over here? Looking good. Now keep in mind, if you cut that portion on the caramel, I'm setting a 20-minute timer, which is usually just about perfect for this portion. It's going to be less than that, so keep that in mind. So I have my molasses and the sugar. As you can see, just dump it right in there. Oh, I waited too long. It stuck to the bottom. But typically, if you weigh it out and dump it right in, you're not going to lose any. And for the most part, for molasses, that's a pretty mess-free situation. All right. So when creaming butter, you want nice soft butter. Then you're going to add your sugar. If it was a different cookie mix that didn't use molasses, I would probably stream in the sugar, letting it hydrate as it whips in. But because it has molasses, I'm going to put it all in at once. I'm going to let that break down until it starts to cut air into it. The fats are absorbing the sugar and combining. So this is chemically altering the base of the butter and making it into a sugar butter, which is the base of your cookie. And this is a standard practice you've probably been doing for years in making cookies. Same thing, but it's called creaming, and it really is the secret to a good cookie texture is having a nice thorough cream. Doing it by hand, you're usually going to have a hard time getting a nice, even leaven out of it. Although there's something to be said about a by-hand cookie that's pretty darn good. But industrial-wise, again, our goal is consistency. So we want to make sure that we're getting a nice, even texture. How much time do I have left? 6 minutes. Perfect. All right, so now I have my flour weight. I'm going to add my other ingredients right on top of here. My baking soda. Get 17 grams of it. And like I said, I'm trying to keep this in a nice, neat pile, if you can see. So if I miss scale, it's really easy to pull that right back out and get back to the number I'm looking for. The other beauty of scaling is that you can measure out everything ahead of time, which I would usually do in a class, but I wanted you guys to experience this. But the beauty of this is you can get everything done. For our work, we would prep everything ahead of time. So I can come in and just hit the ground running and just actually execute the recipe without having to go back and forth with ingredients. So what I like to do is the day before, have it all scaled and ready to go, and that makes my life a lot less complicated the day of production. All right, then I'm gonna do, this is my allspice, which is just 4 grams, not much. Goes a long way. There it is. Sorry? That's what I was saying. You're going to keep it in a little pile so that way you can pull it right back out. If I just kind of spread it all over, then you're kind of up the creek. If you have it in a little pile, you can just fish back out what you didn't need. And then I also like to do like the got it system before I finish and throw it in the mixer. I'm going to kind of go through one last double check, like that's there, that's there, that's there. So that way I know I have everything I need. cinnamon, same thing, 4 grams. Sorry? Yeah, you watch the scale. I mean, it takes a little bit of practice, but I'd say for the most part, the scale does all the work for you. So that's the kind of the beauty of this thing is that it's really easy to tell when things are off. And you could do each individual ingredient in like a cup or in a little container and then add them all together later if you're really concerned about it. This is just kind of a time saver. And I'm doing my 5 grams of ground ginger here. And finally, my 4 grams of salt. All right, so I don't know if you guys can see, I'll kind of show you before I do my final scrape here. My sugar mix has really kind of fluffed up quite a bit. I've whipped enough air into there that I'm feeling pretty good about it. So I don't know if you guys can see this. As you can see, it's kind of got a fluffy texture, a little bit more aerated. Now I'm going to add my eggs at this point. I don't want to add my eggs in right away. Again, I wanted that sugar and butter to become one completely to the point that I've whipped air into it. At that point, I can add the rest. I'm always going to scrape every time between. Butter is always going to push to the sides. Even when I'm all done, I'm going to scrape and remix on a sheet pan, you'll see. And that's going to give you the most even consistency. Never scrape right out of the bowl. First of all, it's bad for the bowl. But secondly, you're going to get a really inconsistent buttery edge and an under-buttered middle. So you always want to make sure you finish that out by hand to get that final incorporation of all the ingredients. All right, pop this right back over here. This makes 12 full-size cookies, or I'm sorry, 6. So what is 6 full-size cookies, or what I would say the half-size batch, a dozen, which is kind of the size that we made for sampling. I'm actually going to take a break from that because my caramel's looking pretty good here. If you guys can see, I don't know if you can, but there's like a good amount of color on here right now. It's starting to get kind of a brownish hue. Basically at this point, it's your discretion of how dark you want your caramel. I could go a little further with this, but I'm going to stop for now. I'm going to stop the heat by putting it in the water. And that's just going to kind of chill down the temperature quite a bit. Now this sugar is still piping hot, so it's not that it's done cooking, just that I've brought it down enough that it's chilled out a little bit. At this point, I'm going to add my salt to my cream. Kind of mix that up a little bit. And I'm going to add it in just a little bit at a time. Now mind you, this is really hot, so it's going to flare up when I put it in. I'm not stirring yet. I haven't stirred it one bit yet. Just adding a little bit at a time. And this is tempered cream. I warmed this up in the microwave about 10 minutes before you guys all got here, so it's not piping hot. You don't want to bring it to a boil. But the warmer you have it, the less of a shock it is when it goes in. You don't want to put super cold into mega hot, or it's going to jump really quickly. Could make a very dangerous hot mess on your counter. So getting them closer to temperature is better. Pouring just a little bit at a time. And this is of the salted cream. Oh yeah, way ahead of you. Way ahead of you, timer. And the salt content on this is going to be kind of high because this is a salted caramel. Typically, you want kind of a salty flavor to that to balance out the super sweetness that is just caramelized sugar. Then, at this point, I'm going to add my bourbon. No, just kidding. That's for later. A little bit at a time. Now, this one I didn't temper, and you can see how much more it's activating this. Now, it's brought down the temperature quite a bit already. I like American Bullet, but really you can't go wrong. They're all pretty usable. Makers is really good as well. It's just a little more pricey. So I went for the middle of the road. Then I'm going to add in my butter, and at this point it's time to stir. I'm gently kind of working it back and forth, allowing this butter to kind of work in and create a creaminess across the board here. And also when you're doing this, I probably should have done this from the beginning. This is a high heat spatula, but if you used a home spatula in there, it would melt. So I would recommend using a wooden spoon, even though I didn't just do that. It's going to give you a less likely chance you're going to get melted plastic in your mix. Now ours are industrial grade high heat spatulas, so we're good. But I don't know how many of you have that. I don't have it in my house, I'll put it that way. Oh. No, it is off. At this point, it's just the residual heat from the caramel and the hot sugar that is melting this butter and bringing this down. And then I'm going to let this rest. And really, for the best way for caramel, I feel like the best method is to put it in the fridge overnight and let it set. Put a little plastic over the top, like a metal bowl, and pop it in the fridge when you're done. The next day, it's going to really congeal, and it's going to be the best to work with. If you need to make it all in one day, you certainly can. I could brush this right on top, and it would be wonderful. But it's going to be a lot more cohesive, just like a soup or a marinara, if you give it a day to rest and kind of become one. A lot's changed chemically in these ingredients in a very short amount of time, so a little bit of rest and adjustment time is always good.
If you didn't want to use bourbon, would there be anything else you could use?
You don't need to put anything in there. I like bourbon in there because I think it contrasts the sweet, but you don't need to put anything in there. You could just do it as a caramel. And really, if you put this in the fridge, this is the kind of caramel you could also scoop out and put in a little plastic wrapper and make individual caramels out of, little caramel squares. You can make this for dipping apples in, or really any kind of caramel reason you'd want. This recipe could work. So yeah, the bourbon's absolutely not necessary. It would work just fine without it. I just add it in because I think it adds a nice extra tang and complexity to the flavor.
But it doesn't ruin the proportions then?
No, not at all. Nope. Now this is also something I'm brushing on the top. It's going to be a little bit thicker if you don't add that in. But really, for the most part, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's going to have a little darker color when you're using a bourbon, and it's also going to be a little looser. But mind you, once it is refrigerated, it's going to tighten up just like anything else. Now, we're not going to get that far today, but this is what you're looking for.
Once you make the caramel, how long is it good?
Oh, caramel's awesome. It is good for like a month on the shelf. It is amazing. Because I've cooked out all the dairy completely, it has a very long shelf life. It's almost all sugar. Sugar is a preservative, so it's going to keep for a really long time. Anything with that high percentage of sugar and that low percentage of dairy, and it's cooked at such a high rate, it's essentially ultra pasteurized at this point. So it's shelf stable. And if you put it in the fridge, it'll really keep, I don't know how long, but a very long time. So this batch, like I said, is quite a bit of caramel for a standard home use, but it's also really good caramel you could use for all kinds of things. So get creative. Use your caramel for different stuff. Make your vegetables a little more exciting. All right, so this caramel is ready to sit here and rest. It is pretty much done. So I'm going to put you down here. There it is. That's the one I'm looking for. Okay, we'll get back to the cookies now. All right, so that's going to help. All right. So next I'm going to stream in the eggs slowly. I want to see this egg kind of melt into the recipe before I add the next one. If you just dump them all in, it can make your whole mix break. Now you can always whip it back on high and break it back in, but sometimes you're over creaming the butter to do that. You're better off to add it in as the recipe accepts it. And it's really going to fluff up your recipe quite a bit to your creamed sugar and molasses. It really matters by weight, so yeah. But like I said, your average standard egg is roughly around 50 grams. The ones that I grabbed were about 45. No, but if you're going by weight, it really doesn't matter. You know, you can kind of adjust that as needed. So if you realize that 2 eggs is over, then you can just scale out some of the whites and you're good. The key is to get the full amount of yolk in there. The egg whites are not as important to the weight. So usually if you're going to be slightly over, you can just remove a little bit of the egg whites and you're good to go. I'm going to put this up a little higher here and really whip this in. I'm going to scrape this down 1, maybe 2 more times. The best mixes are the ones that are fully incorporated, and that requires extra scraping. Now, if you're looking at this, compared to that original butter, which was about 1/4 of this, it's much more volume. We really haven't added that much ingredient. It's a lot of air in here, and it's kind of a fluffy texture. I'm almost to where I want to be. Pretty darn close. This is probably good enough that we could call it, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to finish it up right. Get it nice and fluffy. Now, mind you, like I said, if you don't have a KitchenAid, you certainly could do this by hand. You're just going to have a sore tricep at the end of the day. So at this point, next time after I scrape, I'm ready to add the rest of my ingredients. So I'm just going to do a real quick got it system, go through, look at my ingredients, 540 grams of white flour, got it. My butter's in the bowl, granulated sugar in the bowl, molasses in the bowl, egg in the bowl. Baking soda, got it right here. Cinnamon, got it right here. Allspice, have it right here. Ginger, have it right here. And 4 grams of salt, have it right here. So I'm good to go. At this point, that I'm confirmed everything is in there, what would be a shame is if when you turn on that mixer and a little bit puffs out the side, just a smidge, that happens to be like all the ginger or all the leaven or all the baking powder or all the baking soda, whatever it is. So at a point when you realize everything's in there, I'm always going to mix my dries together. Usually I'd whisk it. I didn't bring a whisk because I'm going to forget something. But this works just fine. And I want to make sure I get all the ingredients in the recipe is the goal. So that if anything puffs out, it's going to be such a small fraction of something else, it's not going to ruin my mix. I have had people that have done it just perfectly, didn't do that part, dumped it in, had a little bit jump out, and their cookies were all hockey pucks. And they thought, what happened? And you probably didn't whisk your dries. In our world of bakery, there's really nowhere to hide. If you make a mistake, everyone's going to know it. It's very obvious. The best way to do everything and not have errors is to have it be exactly precise and follow the instructions. Great. So at this point, my cookie is looking pretty darn good.
So can you leave that too long?
You can. Yeah, you definitely can. Now, if you get like a real pale color, over-creamed cookie is going to spread really, really wide and kind of look junky. They'll probably run into each other. They won't have the height that you're looking for. They'll be really thin. Also, if you scrape the bowl, half of them will do that. Half of them will have this look that'll be a cookie on one half and the other half kind of like running off to the side, and that's going to be the side with too much butter. So yeah, you can definitely overdo it. And that's a lot easier to do in the summer. This is going to come together a lot quicker in the summer when you're using room temperature butter. Fat knows how cold it is outside. It doesn't matter what the air conditioner is doing. It seems like ingredients a lot of the time just instinctually know that it is warm out and then the butter is just going to be softer, or it's cold out and the butter is going to be a lot harder. All right, this looks great. So at this point, just kind of going to go around the room. You can see I kind of have a real fluffy texture to this. All my eggs are in there, all my sugar, everything that I'm looking for in terms of texture is right about there. It's almost doubled in size from the original ingredients, which were barely enough to coat the bowl. Now I have this nice fluffy mix. Right? Yeah. All right. Gonna get enough photo ops at work. This is great. I feel like a real big deal here. All right. So I'm getting everything back off my hands. Gloves are great. You don't need them if you're at home, but I like gloves because it makes your life a lot easier. Just toss them when you're done. All right, so next, dump my ingredients in. Now you can just dump it, but you might jump some on the side. So this is a little trick that we always use. Always scoop from the side as opposed to dumping. And that's going to get everything in there so that your last bit is that. If I just dumped it, I might lose some over the side, and that would be devastating if I messed up my margin at that point in the recipe, right? Done so much right to screw it up right there. It would just be a bummer. So now this is going to come together pretty quick. At this point, all the creaming and the texture is done. Now I'm just looking for the ingredients to get hydrated. So I'm not going to put this at a high speed. Put it at a pretty low speed and kind of pulse to start. Allow that work together. Sheet pan, there it is. And now this is also a pretty dry mix. So if you undercream your butter, it's really going to come out dry. That extra air that you whip into it is going to loosen the recipe a little bit. This is actually a mix that's pretty cool. It like cleans the bowl for you because it has such low hydration. So it's kind of a neat process. You'll know it's done because literally clean the bowl side. It's jumping off the side and you can see that it's all incorporated. I don't see any dries. I don't see any wets. It looks like it's all about right. At this point, get everything off of here. And I do this every time I have a cookie mix. I'm going to take the whole thing, plop it out onto a sheet pan. Baking pan will be fine. Heck, your counter will be fine if you're cool with that. But what I want to do is make sure that I have it all mixed together. And anything that was on the side, any butter that was hiding, is going to be evenly incorporated. And it all looks about the same in terms of texture and color. Great. Now from here, you're ready to scoop. This recipe has this particular look on the top. And when you scoop it, it has this kind of like rippled look. I'd recommend, now you can bake these right away, but I would really recommend putting them back in the fridge. Again, so much has happened to these ingredients chemically, we want them to kind of bind back together. So the refrigerator is a really nice tool to kind of bring everything together. It also makes it a lot easier when you're ready to fire it off. You can do it as needed. And also when you're doing your cookie scoops, to make sure you get a full scoop all the way to the bottom, so you're getting even portions each time.
Is there a size on that scoop?
It could be any size. This is just one that I grabbed. This is a 2 scoop, but really, it doesn't matter. It'll make whatever size cookie you choose to scoop. At that point, the portions have been decided. Yep. But they're all little. We use one about 3 times the size when we're making it at Madison Sourdough, and it's a big cookie. It's a $1.90 cookie, so it's a lot of dough. And then in the end, before you bake it, you take your sugar and just kind of roll it like that before you bake it. And when it's cool, it really is going to hold that look on the top. And the finished product has the beautiful glisten on the top. You can see the wrinkles that come through. That's kind of how you get that look, is rolled in sugar at the end. It's also going to give you that crispy bite. This recipe also, if done properly with enough leaven, the inside should be kind of chewy. So it's not a ginger snap. It's kind of a chewy molasses cookie. So that is and that's true for chocolate chip, oatmeal, whatever cookie you're making. If you use this technique that I just showed, and add things slowly and incorporate things and mix them until they're all together before you add the next ingredients, you're going to get a much more even, stable, standard product. So you're going to, I keep saying a lot, you're noticing, things being consistent, and that's really our goal. There's a huge difference in my mind from the cook world to the baker's world. And like I said, I kind of live in both. I cook and I work with cooks and I work with chefs all the time. I would equate baking and cooking to, cook is like rock and roll, baking is the symphony. Both require a lot of technical skill, a lot of background, but the symphony's goal is accuracy, to nail that version of that song as accurately as possible. Rock and roll is different every night. It's a magical experience, a dash of this, a little bit of that. Whoever's working the line, that same recipe could be plated differently, could have a little different portion every night. And really, you're at the whim of who's on the line, really, in finishing these products as to how that's going to be presented that day. And also, there's a lot more variables. So there's a lot more magic in the world of cooking. It can also go really wrong in the world of cooking. Bakers, I'd say it's a little less dramatic. Our world's a little more even-keeled. The personalities of bakers are typically not like me. They're typically more cerebral, shy types that are going to, double-check their math and, have their head down and are very focused. And then cooks that are really good are usually very interesting, loud, type 1 personalities that, have kind of jump around from one way to a next based on the situation. And usually they say something crazy, and then at the end of the night we all have a drink and forget about it. But that's not as much with our shift hours also. It's just not the same culture. It's a lot more about being even-keeled, showing up to work with enough sleep to produce that day and not have any excuses. And managing your own variables is the same as baking. So I'm managing temperature of my ingredients, the time in which it takes to get them to where I need, that's going to change. But everything else, it's about precision. And this piece of equipment is the one single best thing you can buy if you're looking for a consistent recipe. Or if you want to take your own recipe and improve it, scale it out, figure out what it is. It's a lot easier to make adjustments if you're like, hey, maybe I'd like it a little more gooey. Well, you could add a small percentage of butter, a small percentage of egg, and see where that gets you and kind of test bake. And that's what we do when we test bake. We take note of everything so we can see what the difference is in those variables and then adjust our recipe accordingly. And then that recipe is permanent. It doesn't, if you have that, it's going to work every time. Go ahead.
It said preheat oven to 305. Should it be 350?
No, 305 is what I would recommend. Yeah, 305 is, that's a convection oven. But yeah, but 305 is ideal. 350 is, for some cookies is all right, but for others is really not going to be ideal. If you have too much heat, you're going to put a crust on the outside before it can finish spreading. So you want to allow it to bake and melt that butter and spread and not be too tall. If you bake it too fast at too high of a temperature, that crust is going to impede its ability to spread out lengthwise to its full extent. Before, yeah.
The regular oven, I have a convection.
Yeah.
So still 305.
Yeah, 305. And then, if I'm doing like a biscuit, I'll do it at 400 degrees to get a good jump and then drop it down to 345 to end to finish the bake. So like there's different techniques that you're going to use the heat to make things do what you want them to do. Yes?
I got one of those convection stove, whatever things.
Induction burners? Yeah.
And I would return because I guess I first of all, I don't cook very much at all. And
Okay.
I guess I just didn't understand what
The benefit?
benefit was.
Well, I mean, here's the deal. These heat through magnets. So you're using magnetics to heat. That's why it needs to be stainless steel. If I put an aluminum pellet on it, it wouldn't work. So it's heating through magnets. It's 360 degrees of heat. So it actually heats up faster and more evenly than like a gas or electric, which is hot spots and cold spots. I mean, for here, it's great because there's no fumes or anything else. It's a lot easier to use. It's a lot more flexible. Downside, you got to buy special pots and pans for it. If you go with a magnet to the store, if the magnet sticks to it, it'll work. That's kind of the way it works. So cast iron works on these. So yeah, it gives you a little more flexibility. It uses a lot less energy, eco-wise. It's an improvement. I still prefer gas myself. I've used it enough that that's my preference, but I've worked enough with these to say that they're definitely worth having. Yes.
And so if you were working on gas, you would still do the approach where you're not stirring it?
Yep. Same thing, high heat all the way. The higher the temperature, the quicker the water boils off, but it's not going to burn that sugar. That sugar has a melting temp of like 2,000 degrees. So like it's really going to take a long, long time for that sugar to burn. That's why it takes about 20 minutes of direct high heat for it to get hot enough that the sugar's broken down enough and caramelized enough that I'm ready to even go to the next step. If I left it on there much longer, another 10 minutes, the whole room would be filled with smoke and it would be a problem. So really, you want to keep an eye on it once you start getting that color. But after that, it's, it doesn't matter what kind of heat, electric, gas, or otherwise.
You draw grams and liters and say, you're talking Fahrenheit, aren't you, the temperature?
Yes.
Why did they abandon Celsius?
Well, I mean, we have Celsius that we use, but that's just very uncommonly known. I think that America in general doesn't. I can't recall the difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Everything I've always done is in Fahrenheit. So I did it in Fahrenheit. It's bad enough that I made you guys use metric. Let's not get crazy,
In Europe, they use Celsius?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's no downside to the metric system in terms of weighing out things for ingredients. In fact, I do it with my cook recipes as well. I convert everything to the metric system, and I get much better outcome as a result.
There's a question.
Yes?
What kind of baking pans do you like to use?
Your standard either steel or aluminum baking pans. This recipe that I made for the caramel pecan bar is for a half sheet pan. Thank you. You brought me right into my next task, which is this size. This is what the caramel pecan recipe I made you is portioned for. I brought some pie dough that was pre-made. It's a little bit old, but it doesn't matter because we're not going to eat it. Usually it'll be a little lighter color than this. This is as it ages, it gets a little bit darker. But this is the pie dough recipe that I gave you as well. Now that's a really dry recipe. I'm going to talk you through it real quick.
Can I ask a cookie question?
Sure, go right ahead.
If you were gonna put nuts or chips or something, would you do it with your mixer, or do you just do it when you do that?
No, I do it with the mixer, but at the very end. Just like when I added that flour in, I would add it at that point. And honestly, a little trick with nuts and chocolate chips that's kind of cool. If you dig a well in your mix that before you pour everything in, I always put my chocolate chips or nuts or whatever in, just half of it in first, then dump the rest of my flour, and then sandwich on top the rest of my chips. And what that's going to do is going to hold down that puffy experience from when you turn on the mixer. It's also going to scrape the bottom of the bowl and kind of incorporate everything a lot more evenly. So yeah, I'd recommend adding it at the point where you're cleaning your last mix of the butter, sugar, egg before you're adding your dries. That's when you'd want to add that in. And you don't want to overmix it to break them down. If you're mixing it post that long enough that the chips are breaking down, you're definitely overmixing the cookie. That's where you're really going to, the creaming is usually not where you're going to overmix a cookie. Where you're going to overmix a cookie is when you add in the dries. If you let it go for too long, it's going to make the flour start to develop strength, and it's really going to not allow the cookie to spread the way it wants either. Working flour makes it a little stronger, and for a pie dough, that's perfect. For a cookie, that's not really what we're looking for. Any other cookie questions? Okay, I'm going to move forward to the pie dough. So the pie dough, the main thing you want to make sure you do is use cold butter. I'm going to take my cold butter and cut I'd use like a whole pound if you can. You can use sticks if you want, but they just melt a lot faster. I think it's easier to use a block like this when you're making a pie dough because it keeps cold a little faster. Cut out the squares, and you can cut them into about pinky-sized cubes. You're going to want to cut it cold and then put that cold cubed butter right into the flour that you weighed out. When you add the butter into the flour and you mix it, it'll actually allow the cubes to come apart, and they won't stick together. The flour will allow them to all separate. And at that point, I'd take the entire flour and cubed butter mix, put it back in the fridge for a minute, just to bring it back down to temp. Your goal with the pie dough is to keep that butter marbled throughout it. And if you mix it down too far, the butter's too warm, you're going to lose it, and it's going to change. It's going to hydrate your dough, and that's not what your goal is. It's kind of the opposite direction with a pie dough. You're trying to pull moisture from the butter and coat that flour in butter without breaking down the butter completely. So you're going to put it in the mixer, and you're going to start to mix with your flour, your salt, and your butter after it's been cold. You start to break that down until the butter is no longer, I'll say about this, I'll say thumb size to start, pinky nail size when you think it's almost done. Then I'd also have a pitcher of water that you put some ice in and then fill up with water and let that rest for a second. And that's going to bring that water down to ice water temperature. Then hold like a spoon or a spatula to hold back your ice, and then pour that and scale your water from there. That's going to give you the coldest water you're going to work with without chunks of ice in there, which you really don't want because they're not going to hydrate. They're going to end up putting weird little spots in your dough of moisture, which you don't want. So then you're going to work that in, and then you're going to pour the water in once your flour is broken down, but you still see clumps of butter in there, but it's starting to break down about pinky size. You're going to pour that water that you scaled right in at a medium pace and allow that to mix together. It should be a pretty dry mix, and when it starts to hydrate enough that it's shaggy and your mixer's starting to struggle, I'd stop at that point, flour your bench, and finish it on the actual bench because I don't want to work that butter so far that it completely absorbs into the flour. I want there to be that marbled, speckled butter throughout. That's going to give it a nice crispiness when you bake it later. Then at that point, you're going to put it into like a clump, wrap it in plastic, and put it in the fridge, and it'll come out like this. At this point, remember when I talked about a blind bake at the beginning? This is how I would recommend doing this. So this is called the dough docker. Dough docker is great. It adds an extra crispiness to your dough. If you'll notice, like you get a thin crust pizza, frozen from the grocery store. There's little dots on the bottom, little holes. They dock that dough to keep it crispy. That's the idea. By breaking the structure of the dough, it's not going to leaven together. It's going to be between each hole is its own little chunk of strength right there. So that's kind of what we're looking for. So we'll put that down. Flour the top. And whenever I'm pinning out, always do small but powerful strokes to kind of get this the shape that you want. You don't want to just like squish it and move it all over. I want to kind of level it out at the end, but to get it the shape I want, smaller strokes are going to get me where I'm looking for. Flip it over. If anyone's going to ask me about my rolling pin, you don't need to get this kind of rolling pin. You can use the same one you have with the wheels on the side. Doesn't make any difference. I prefer, the beveled edge one piece personally, but it doesn't make a difference. Now at this point, when I'm getting it close to the size that I want, in terms of fitting in the sheet pan, now I'm going to start leveling it out to try and get it a little more even. But if I started doing that, I'd get great big cracks that would go between, and I'd have to try and reseal them, and that's just not going to work as well. To slowly spread it like this keeps it a lot more intact and keeps it all one piece of dough. Time. Oh boy, I'm running out of time. All right. Then at this point, I'm going to dock it. These things are cheap. You can get them at Kesnick's for $15, $20. It's a great tool to have, especially if you do pizza nights at home. If you want an extra crispy crust, flip it. Kesnick's restaurant warehouse, it's over off Fair Oaks Ave. I mean, you can get them in a lot of places, but they have all the industrial stuff there. It's kind of easy to find all in one spot. If you want extra flaky, you dock both sides like that. Now, it's called a dough docker. Dough docker. Yes. Now I'm going to spray my pan. Now I only have full-size sheet pans or full-size parchments there. If you do get your hands on these, here's a nice little trick. Use a serrated blade, fold it in half, just like that, bada bing, half sheet pan. So I sprayed that so it'll actually stick to the bottom, and so there won't be any air gaps in between. Then I'm going to spray on top one more time so that they pop right out when I'm done. Now I can take my dough and just lay it in place. And then from here, there's going to be a little excess. You can just kind of cut that off. Like that. Like that. And like this. Great. At this point, if you have some dried beans, lima beans or that are uncooked, lentil beans, something like that, take another parchment that's bigger, ideally, put it on the top, and then you're going to blind the top. You can even use marbles. You can use anything that's not going to burn. Line that, pour it on top, and then bake this in the oven for about 8 and 8 minutes at 350. I have the exact things on the recipe. I don't recall what I wrote down, but that's the one you want. And what that's going to do is partially bake this so that it has a crispy side on each side, but by putting the weight, it doesn't allow it to souffle or bubble up. It's going to keep it compressed, but it's partially baked. So when I put my filling on top, it's not going to get soggy. It has a little bit of room to absorb some moisture before I bake it again to finish it off. Once you, in the pecan cream that I had you make, same technique as this. You're going to cream, sugar, and butter. You're going to take pecans, whole pecans, grind them in a food processor until they're broken down to almost like a flour consistency. Just like a cookie mix, once that's at a good leavening kind of cream texture, you're going to put that ground nut meal in there, let that work in. And then at the end, you're going to stream in your eggs at the very end and scrape that. The reason you use eggs at the end is because you want the whole thing to leaven and be kind of wrapped around the nuts. If you did it earlier and then just add the nuts on top, it kind of suppresses the leaven a little bit. So in that kind of format, you'd add the eggs in last. Then you take that, pour that right on top of here, level it out, take your pecans, put some on top, and then bake it. And once it's baked, you take your caramel, brush that on the top, and you're ready to serve. It's even better if you put it in the fridge to set. At this point, we are ready to hand out the finished product. So we have some hot apple cider. So now we have some hot apple cider as well. If you guys don't have if you have a preference or any kind of affinity against cinnamon, let them know. Otherwise, we're going to put a tiny little speck of cinnamon stick in there, and then we'll bring out a little sample of each to you. It's kind of a lot to hit in an hour and a half. Any other questions? Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And what I like to do with these is get just a ring and use this same technique, and then par bake the ring, pull the ring off, and then build my dough, my pie right inside there. And you get that beautiful ledge then without even using a pie crust or a pie pan. Yeah, like a pastry ring. It's like a round thing with no bottom. Right, and then you put it on a sheet pan. You dock your dough, put it on the sheet pan, and then put this on top and blind bake it. Once you blind bake it, it structurally is sound. And you don't really need. So if you look at our pecan pies that we sell, they weren't baked in a pie pan. They were baked just with a ring. Then we remove the ring, fill the pie, and finish it off. So, yes?
Two questions. First of all, my old school recipes say sift the flour with the dry ingredients. Is there any reason you can't just whisk it?
No, not really. I mean, if you have old flour that's really clumpy, it might be a good idea to sift it, yeah. I mean, really what they're trying to do is avoid having moisture that's gotten into your flour that's going to give you like dough boogers. Sorry, it's an industry term, but yeah.
Second question is, if I use my lentils and when I'm blind baking, can I use those, throw those in my soup later on, or are they done?
No, you're probably only going to want to use those for blind baking at that point. But if they're not cooked yet, they're fine. I mean, you can reuse them over and over and over and over. I mean, we use ours for years, and we use them every single day. So, yes.
So I'm a little stuck on how you increase recipes that have baking powder in them. My understanding is that when you double a recipe, the lift changes if you double the amount of baking powder.
I don't know if I agree with that. I would say that the percentage of the ingredient should, the the end quantity shouldn't matter. The percentage should. So that percentage won't change. So if the number of flour goes up, that same percentage of baking powder should go into that recipe, and it should work out the same. So yeah, so that's why baking by percentage is a lot more accurate and easier to do than with tablespoons and teaspoons and that kind of like. There's a variable of what you're going to lose each time, and so they're probably telling you add a little extra so you make sure you get a lift, because odds are you probably weren't accurate. You see what I mean? It's a slippery slope here with the cups. They just keep getting less and less accurate. So that might have been where that old recipe, wives' tales, has come from. But I would recommend, if you're going by percentage, it doesn't matter if I'm making 1 or 150. That percentage should tell me if I don't know the flour weight, the rest should be accurate. Yes?
2 questions. What kind of spray do you prefer? And if you dock a pie crust and it's a fruit pie, you don't have to worry about the fruit like seeping through the crust.
No, not really. No, I don't think that's an issue. If it's like a cherry pie or something like that. No, I don't think that's much of an issue. Especially if you're using it in a pan or something like that, you're really good. I wouldn't, I'd always recommend if you're going to do a panless crust to do it over a sheet pan, just so that it doesn't make a mess in your oven. But no, that shouldn't make any kind of difference. And then, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question?
What kind of spray do you prefer?
I just use a Vegeline veggie spray. Really, any of these would be fine. You don't want to use like the grill kind, but other than that, any kind of canola-based, olive oil-based veggie spray, they're all pretty good. We use a vegetable spray, but I've used a lot and they don't really make any difference. Yes? Okay, so if you're making a full sheet pan and you want to cut by hand and you want it to look pretty, first of all, I divide by the area that's the most easy, which is going to be right down the center, right? So I'm going to mark on this side, mark on that side, and then connect the dots. After that, I'm not going to cut all the way through. I'm just going to mark the tops so that I know where I'm going. Then from there, divide that in half. And then from there, divide that in half. So that way, you're only having to look at visually, looking at halves and halves, and then half and half. It's a lot easier to break it down that way than to the other way you can cheat is make a little template out of cardboard and then use that. But it's really, if you're dividing it that way, and then the same way this way, even this way, and then split the difference. Wipe the knife in between every time. Yeah, you're going to want to have a wet rag with you. And once you cut in and you cut all the way down, lift out, wipe, and then go and finish the cut, and then wipe. Anytime you get a restaurant and they're cutting cake, pie, anything like that, you'll notice that's what they do. If you go back with a dirty knife, you're done. It looks terrible. The one thing at Thanksgiving, it's a totally different thing when you're in a restaurant. They expect it to look perfect, so that's the way that you're always going to clean the knife between each cut. Any other questions?
Okay, she had a question, but she doesn't want to ask it.
Okay, you ask it for her.
When you're making a pie crust, like for an apple pie,
Yeah.
would you use that docker or whatever, is that what it's called?
Yeah, dough docker. I mean, it depends. If you want like a rustic apple pie, then yeah. If you're going to use like a lattice crust top, you probably wouldn't do that to the lattice or anything like that. I just do that on the bottom because if you want a flaky crust, this is what you want to go for. If you want more of like an even crust with no flakes in between, you just want it to be kind of crispy on both sides, you wouldn't need to dock it and just flash bake it. I don't ever recommend making a pie without blind baking it first. I think that it just makes the filling congeal better if it has somewhere it can absorb. It makes the crust stick together. It doesn't stick to the pie crust as much when you're cutting it out because that butter in this dough is already cooked once. You're cooking it again. It's fully removed. It's ready to pop right out of there. You're just going to get a better product than if you just bake right into a raw dough. But that's not what Pepperidge Farm or all these other people tell you to do. They tell you to pour right in and you're good to go, which is fine. But that's the difference between something that you're like, wow, how did they get that crust? That's how. That's the way that we. Oh, okay, good. Yes?
Would you ever flatten your cookie before you bake it, like you do peanut butter cookies?
Oh,
Or do
I
you
mean, it
just
depends
bake
on the
it like
variety.
in flats?
It's gonna leaven out itself.
Oh, okay.
I don't think you need to. With a peanut butter cookie, it's for the look, that like cross hatch fork thing people like to do. I think it's more for that purpose than for spreading. I think if you squish it too far, you're going to end up with a little wider than you want and a little thinner than you want. Unless that's what you're going for, a belly button or something like that. That might be something you're going for. It's the kind of cookie. It's really high butter. But and those you kind of squish down. But usually if the recipe is a good recipe, you shouldn't need to do that. It's a really good indication that it's been well mixed and a proper technique if it finishes out the right size. Yes? You're welcome. No problem. Tony, do you have anything else?
Kind of decided if people are leaving, they could take
Sure.
maybe
That sounds great.
we don't
So
want
we
to
have hot apple cider here. You can help yourself. I think it's going to be a little easier for you to grab it than to hand it out. Oh, sure. Why don't you go ahead and let them know about that?
Actually, I have a question for Tyson. Is there anything that you would like us to know about Madison sourdough that we might not know?
We work pretty heavily with local purveyors. We are all about keeping our money in Dane County and in the state of Wisconsin. We work a lot with direct source for our ingredients. This butter is from Muthridge Butter, which is out of Grassland Dairy in Greenwood, Wisconsin. It is an awesome product. It also is a really affordable European-style butter. We really try our best to source and keep our money in the state. Also, we are spoiled in Wisconsin and foolish to not take advantage of the amazing ingredients that are available to us. We are one of the only bakeries in town that is milling to order. We're one of the only bakeries in town that's doing organically grown, locally produced flour and milling it for each recipe. And we're one of the only bakeries in town that does pretty much exclusively naturally leavened bread. A little benefit of sourdough that you guys might want to know about. Sourdough, and I have a little pamphlet here that I'd be happy to, if you wanted to grab on your way out, help yourself. It's 9 reasons you'd want to eat sourdough. A naturally leavened dough is going to be partially digested. I know there's a heck of a time to sell bread in the world because everybody has such an affinity to gluten and concerns about wheat production and all that sort of things, which is why we're trying to know where our ingredients are coming from, know the actual farmers, and see for a fact that they're not using pesticides. But when you're using a naturally leavened dough like ours, and we use a 72-hour hydration, that whole process from start to finish, that 3-day process to make our bread, in the end, what you're getting is a much easier product for your body to break down. It has more enzymes in it, more nutrition per loaf, and it's going to give you, thus it's going to make you more full and make you feel more satisfied, and it's going to aid in your digestion, not stop your digestion. American baking bread is designed for speed and efficiency. The entire process from start to finish, from ingredients to out of the oven, takes 2 hours roughly. They're blasting this stuff with sugar and all kinds of yeast. When you use an industrial yeast, it's very convenient and an awesome product. But when you're using yeast, it just kind of adds air, and it's a really fast way to do it. With a natural processed dough, you require extra time. And the longer time you take, the more natural sugars you're going to create. The more natural sugars, the more flavor. But there's no added sugar, and there's hardly any ingredients in a sourdough bread. A Wonder Bread is chock full of ingredients you can't pronounce. So there's a huge difference in there, and that's also why our bread is going to last you, takes 3 days, and it really lasts about 4 days with no preservatives. And I call it bread with an intention. You should be purchasing it with a plan to make a meal with it, or you're having people over, you have some cheese, or you have some purpose for it. This idea of buying bread as a staple that lives in your fridge for a month is a crazy concept everywhere in the world but America. So it's really that's really our intention, is to show the European side. Yes.
I just heard about your place. What kind of, they said you have lunch and breakfast there?
Yes, we have put a copy of our menu, I think, on here as well. For our we have breakfast, lunch 7 days a week till 3:30. We serve brunch every day. So come on down. We have awesome food. We have our patisserie right there. You can see the mill on one side of the dining room. It's all through a glass wall. You can watch us mill our flour. On the other side, there's a glass wall where you can see the bakers producing, and then also the kitchen producing your food. So it's all open concept. Makes us keep it really clean all the time. which is kind of nice because it's definitely the cleanest bakery I've ever been a part of. Yeah.
Just a question about the rye bread that was out there. That had a different type of leavening in it, didn't it, than the sourdough?
You talking about the big one? No, that's a sourdough. I mean, if you look at our breads, it's 98% sourdough. All of our breads, there's a common misconception that only white bread is sourdough, and that's inaccurate. You can naturally leaven anything. You can make a rye sour, you can make a white sour, a wheat sour. And with our mill, we can emulate the texture of a white flour a lot easier because we can mill custom to different size flours and get different amounts of bran in it. So it allows us to emulate a white flour while using a whole grain product. Again, more nutrition, more flavor, easier digestion. So there's a lot of benefits to that. The only downside is labor. It takes us 3 days and 12 people to do what a levy does over at Gardner's. So it's a little different in terms of production, but that's also why the price is what it is, and it's also why it makes you feel a little better.
So I couldn't see the creaming and the cream product when you were at that point. So a general rule of thumb, obviously I have not been creaming my sugar and butter together long enough.
Right.
So what am I looking for that it's supposed to look?
I guess the word I would describe is fluffy. You want a fluffy texture. It should be like a fluffy, aerated, like not quite a whipped cream, right? But two ticks back. So you've cut enough air into it that now it's actually fluffed up a little bit. So yeah, it should be a little bit fluffy. It's not just incorporated. You really want it a little to almost get a third larger in volume from the whipped in air and have a fluffy texture. Yeah, this I get this a lot. The whole grain is really, I'm going to sit down. The whole grain flour is really where you're getting the entire nutrition of the entire wheat berry into the flour. A sifted white flour that doesn't have any of the bran, any of the grain is still all right, but the whiter the flour, the harder it is for your body to break down. The more whole wheat or whole grain, the more bran and the more fiber there is in it, the easier for your body to digest. There's also nutrients that you can have access that are accessible that are going to help you enjoy the flavor and also be more nutritious.
Probably one of those things where you want to measure it by the scale instead of the cup.
I mean, it's really just by what kind of flour you're going to put in it. And I think that there are some recipes that call for white flour, and that's going to be on the pastry side. Pastry was never meant to be health food. If you're trying to eat health food, don't make cookies. That's not what they're for. There's plenty of other things that are healthy, but dessert is not one of them. So if you're trying to make a dessert, you want it to be this amazing small portion experience. There's no time for Splenda in dessert, if you ask me. I think that you're supposed to go for it. Or if you wanted to make something healthy like a pasta or a bread or something like that, whole grain is probably what you're looking for, particularly if you have issues digesting wheat. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you account for the change in the quality of the bread when you move from white to wheat or vice versa?
Do you mean when we move locations?
No, I'm sorry. I meant to say because my understanding is that the gluten and the wheat itself, the whole wheat, is more like a knife inside of the mix, and it cuts the fibers.
I wouldn't say that. I would say gluten is the opposite. It is the...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say gluten.
Yeah.
I just meant the whole wheat has a harsher texture to it that causes those linkings to be broken apart more easily.
Yes, I will say that it's a lot easier to get a strong leaven out of a white flour than a wheat flour. Also, a dry dough is going to bloom easier and be easier to work with, but be harder to break down. A wet dough is really difficult to work with on the table, especially if you're not familiar with working with doughs. So the wetter the flour mix, the higher chance it could be something special and be easier to digest. So wheat flour hydrates a little more than white flour. So when working with a wheat dough, you kind of got to go extra heavy on the hydration, which in turn makes it a little harder to work with. But if you can get past that, we develop strength through a process called folds. You can develop strength a couple different ways by mixing it in the dough in the bowl. The longer you mix it, every time you're doing this, you're actually strengthening the gluten, and you can definitely overmix bread, absolutely, and ruin it. You want to reach, your goal with bread is to reach 77 degrees, finished DDT, designated dough temp, at the end. And you're going to control those variables by controlling your water temp and how much hydration you have. But by building strengths, you get a really wet dough, it's like slop. What we do is add folds. So if you think of it like a screen of a door, right? The finished product is one lump of screen. You take that and put it on a wet table and fold it over itself, fold it over itself, fold it over itself, and fold it over itself. Well, now that screen has that many more layers of screen in it, and that's going to strengthen and leaven it that much more. So with a whole grain, high hydration dough, we're going to throw 3, sometimes 6 folds in it, whereas in a white dough, we might only need to do 1. And that's how we're going to create strength without adding friction heat or lowering hydration. So that's a technique that we use at Sourdough that makes our bread all that it could be, while still having the strength to work it on the table without getting really frustrated and it not working.
Is it part of the recipe to put the folds in?
That's a technique that we use. It's usually not written into, if you look at one of these books, which I would recommend any of these, and these are all going to be in metric, you'll notice. None of them are going to be in cups.
I just mean, is there a way to test the dough and say, okay, it's at the right way I need it?
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of test baking. That's why you want to document everything, so that when you figure out a recipe you like, and yeah, and it's going to change. Also, there's a lot of variables. Temperature is your best friend and your worst enemy. So it's really going to kind of change the variables, and you need to keep track. So every time I'm baking, I'm temping everything from the water temp that I'm putting in at the start to the finished dough temp at the end, to when I'm putting it on the table, seeing where it's at. If it's cold, it's going to be slow. If it's hot, it's going to move fast. So yes, actually, you'll find that bakery there's a lot of paperwork, a lot more than you're going to see in a kitchen. Kitchen, they don't write down anything. Like you said, it's a dash of this, into that, this much of that, and so it's a different world. But when you understand those variables, it's a little easier to do. What's that?
Did you go to culinary school?
Culinary arts school? No, I did not. No, I managed to learn this all in the industry. I was lucky enough to work with some really talented people that gave me I went to school for music. I was going to be a vocal performance major. Well, thank you. It's a little harsh right now. But yeah, no, like I said, baking kind of found me. I didn't expect to be a baker, but it really kind of, my life, you can be good at more than one thing, and I find happiness is really succeeding more than challenging yourself sometimes. And there's plenty to learn here. So when I finally sunk my teeth into this and said, okay, I'm a baker, my God, there was so much information to learn. But I was lucky enough, and I'd say in the service industry, if you're driven and a hard worker and can handle failing and learning from those failures, and I personally, I always say this and people think I'm crazy, but I love to fail. Failing is my favorite thing, because I'm going to learn, and that is going to be a permanent piece of information when I overcome that failure. That's going to be a lesson I can teach and learn from and grow from a lot more permanently than just following a recipe and having it work, So I'd say not being afraid of failing and not being afraid of hard work. It really does allow anyone could jump into this industry with the right attitude and a strong back and end up being a pretty good baker. But it definitely takes a certain personality to make it work.
You're lovely.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Really, before quick question. I'd like to know your favorite bread and your favorite pastry or cookie from sourdough. Or
I actually brought my favorite bread tonight, which is the miche. It kind of tells our story of our identity, which is we make bread. It's a communal oven idea. The originally, 2,000 years ago when they first discovered bread, which is amazing that they did in the first place. Such a complicated process, but when they discovered it, there was the bread guild, the people that baked off the bread for the community were kind of like royalty, and they'd work these big community ovens, and everyone would bring their doughs, and then they'd score the top and flour the top and put a different mark for each family, so you'd know whose bread is whose. And then they bring that out, and it was kind of this idea that it was the baker's job to feed their community and finish off their bread and nourish them. A lot of the kings originally used to control the poor population by giving them free bread from the bread guilds, and they would hand that out to the masses, because certainly the numbers alone, they could take over the castle at any point if they all got together. But if they weren't starving, it made it a lot easier. So they'd hand out bread to the people, and they keep all the white flour for themselves, and jokes on them, because the whole grain flour was healthier.
pastry-wise.
But yeah, I think our miche tells the story of the communal oven. It's whole grain flour, locally produced, in that 5-pound loaf format. Gives it this amazing texture. There's more sugars that are developed when you get that big of a bread, and there's so much more inside crumb and less outside surface area that you really get an interesting flavor and texture combination. And that bread actually changes over 7 days.
The library will close in 15
Uh-oh, I'm all long-winded. And then pastry.
machines for checkout. Thank you.
And then in terms of pastry, I think that my favorite product right now, I think Pierre's eclairs are out of this world. Now they're rich, but the fillings that he comes up with are just out of this world amazing. Orange pistachio, pastry cream filled, different things that are just amazing. So I really love that product. So those would probably be my two.